I was there, kneeling on the cold floor of the dark room, too weary to continue praying, when I saw the image of Our Lady softly glowing on the bookshelf. The problem is, I was absolutely certain I hadn't put it there. I myself had thrown it in the trash weeks before, in anger and disdain. But there it was, serene, as if watching me with compassion, while my 6-year-old son battled an illness doctors said was incurable. In that moment, everything I believed about faith, about God, about miracles, crumbled and rebuilt itself in a matter of seconds. And today, 5 years later, I need to tell this story because maybe you too need to hear that sometimes God works in ways our rational minds will never comprehend. My name is Rick. I'm 37, a father of 2, and for most of my adult life I was a fervent evangelical Christian. Not just evangelical, but one of those you might call a fundamentalist. I grew up in a strict Pentecostal family, where any manifestation of faith that didn't exactly follow the dogmas of our denomination was considered heresy, or worse, idolatry. My father was a deacon, my mother led the choir, and I practically grew up inside the church, absorbing from childhood an almost instinctive distrust of anything outside our specific interpretation of the scriptures. When I married Lucy at 25, she shared this same conviction. We were the young couple everyone in the congregation admired. We participated in all the services. I preached occasionally. She played the piano, and together we led the youth ministry. Our life was built around the church, Bible studies, prayer campaigns. It was a good life, structured, full of purpose, or at least I believed it was. The first signs that something was different began when I inherited my paternal grandmother, Mary's, house. She had died at 89, after a lifetime of being a respected figure in the family, but always viewed with some reservation by the younger members of our church. Grandma Mary was a devout Catholic, one of the old-fashioned kind, who said the rosary every day and had images of saints scattered throughout her house. During my childhood, when we visited her, my parents always made sure to explain to me that those things were nothing but superstition, that only Jesus could intercede for us, and that venerating images was breaking the second commandment. Even so, I always had a special fondness for her. Grandma Mary had a unique way of making me feel loved. When I had nightmares, she would soothe me in her arms, whispering prayers in Latin that I didn't understand, but that somehow calmed me. There was a peace in her presence that I could never explain, but that I also never questioned. After all, she was my grandmother, and grandmothers have this natural power to comfort us, don't they? When she passed away, I inherited the house where she had lived, an old but solid building in a quiet neighborhood. Lucy and I decided to move there with our 2 children, Matthew, who was 5 at the time, and little Lily, who was only 2. The house needed some renovations, but the space was much larger than our rented apartment, and we would finally have our own home. The first few weeks were spent on heavy cleaning. Grandma Mary had accumulated a lifetime of objects, photographs, and antique furniture. But what bothered me most were the religious images. There were crucifixes in almost every room, pictures of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and at least a dozen images of Our Lady in different advocations. To me, all of that represented exactly the kind of Catholicism I had learned to reject: the idolatry, the veneration of images, the deviation from the focus that should be solely on Christ. Lucy shared my opinion. We decided to donate most of the pieces to some Catholic church in the area, but I confess I did it more as a way to get rid of them than out of charity. I wanted to clean the house, purify it, make it a truly Christian home. We hung Bible verses on the walls, placed a small bookshelf with books on Reformed theology, and transformed one of the rooms into a space for our family prayer times. But there was one image I couldn't donate immediately. It was stored in an old box at the back of the closet in the master bedroom, a small statue of Our Lady, made of plaster, about 8 inches tall. It wasn't particularly beautiful or valuable, but there was something about the serene expression on its face that caught my attention. Her hands were slightly open, as if she were offering something, or perhaps receiving. Her eyes were gentle, almost maternal, and for a split second, when I first picked it up, I felt a strange familiarity, as if I had seen it before. But the feeling didn't last long. Soon my rational mind took over, and the anger I felt for everything that image represented returned with full force. "This is pure idolatry," I muttered to myself. "It has no place in my house." Without ceremony, I walked to the kitchen trash can and threw the small statue among the leftover food and dirty paper. "Only Jesus comes in here," I said aloud, as if declaring a spiritual possession over my new home. That night, I slept peacefully, convinced that I had done the right thing. I had purified my home of influences I considered harmful to my faith. But around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a strange sound coming from the backyard. It was like a soft song, almost a melodic whisper that seemed to float in the night air. At first I thought it was some insomniac neighbor listening to music, but the sound had a different quality. It was more organic, closer. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Lucy, and walked to the kitchen window overlooking the backyard. What I saw completely baffled me. There was a female figure, dressed in what looked like a white veil, standing next to the trash can where I'd thrown the statue. The figure was facing away from me, but even in the darkness, I could make out its silhouette against the neighbor's wall. For a moment, my heart stopped. I blinked several times, trying to focus, but when I looked again, no one was there. "Must have been sleepiness," I murmured to myself, returning to bed, but the unease remained. There was something about that vision that deeply unsettled me, not exactly fear, but an inexplicable anxiety. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to every creak of the old house, every rustle of the wind in the backyard trees. In the following days, strange things started happening, little things, individually explainable, but together forming a disturbing pattern. The kitchen lights flickered for no apparent reason, even after I checked all the wiring. The candles Lucy used to scent the home lit themselves. I'd find them burning in the morning, even though I was sure they were out the night before. The living room radio played Latin music, soft, melancholic melodies I didn't recognize, even when it was unplugged. Lucy started noticing the oddities too, but initially we tried to find practical explanations. "Must be a wiring problem," she'd say about the lights. "Maybe the boys are messing with the candles," she'd suggest about the scented candles mysteriously lit. As for the radio, we even called a technician, who found no fault with the appliance. But what truly disturbed me was the constant feeling of being watched. During the day, working in the office I'd set up in the back room, I felt as if someone was standing behind me, following my every move. At night, while watching television or reading in the living room, I had the impression of a silent presence in the room, something I couldn't see, but that was definitely there. I started questioning my own sanity. How could a grown man, a family man, a church leader, be affected by such childish superstitions? I prayed constantly, asking God to remove any evil influence from my home, to protect my family from any kind of spiritual oppression. But the phenomena continued, and my anxiety only increased. It was a Saturday morning, about 2 weeks after the trash can incident, that I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. I was leaving to take Matthew to soccer practice when I saw, right next to the front gate, the same statue of the Virgin Mary I had thrown in the trash. It was intact, clean, as if it had just been taken off a shelf. There were no signs that it had been in the trash, no damage or dirt. But what truly terrified me was a small phrase written in blue ink at the base of the statue: "Son, I never left you." My first reaction was sheer panic. I dropped the statue and ran inside, locking the door behind me, as if that could protect me from some invisible threat. My heart was pounding so hard, I felt the pulse in my neck. "Lucy," I yelled, calling for my wife. "Someone's playing a prank on us. Someone's been in our backyard." But the dreams continued. Every night, for almost a week, I had similar visions. Sometimes I was a child, sometimes an adult, but she was always there, the same woman, with the same expression of unconditional love, offering comfort that transcended any rational understanding. In some dreams, She showed me scenes from my childhood that I'd forgotten, difficult moments, moments of loneliness, moments when I felt abandoned or misunderstood. And in all those moments, even if I hadn't realized it at the time, she was there, silently watching over me. I began waking up every morning with the same feeling of longing, as if I were being separated from a mother I'd never consciously known, but who had been present throughout my life. It was confusing, unsettling, but at the same time comforting in a way that defied all my theological training. During this time, Lucy noticed I was different, more introspective, more sensitive. Several times she found me staring at the small image we now kept on the living room table, not out of veneration, but out of a curiosity I couldn't explain myself. "Are you okay?" she'd ask. "You seem to have something on your mind." But how could I explain to my fervent evangelical Christian wife that I was having dreams about a figure that seemed to be exactly what our denomination considered pure idolatry? What followed was a sequence of consultations, tests, hospitals, and waiting rooms that became our new routine. Matthew, who had always been a brave child, faced each new step with a determination that broke my heart. "You don't need to worry, Dad," he told me one morning, when I was particularly anxious before another round of tests. "Jesus will take care of me, right?" My son's innocent faith inspired me, and tortured me at the same time. Yes, I believed Jesus would take care of him. I had dedicated my entire life to preaching exactly that. But why then did I feel such a deep fear growing in my chest? Why, despite all the prayers, all the fasts, all the intercessory campaigns we organized at church, did I feel like I was losing control of the situation? The diagnosis arrived on a rainy Tuesday in July. The pediatric oncologist, a kind middle-aged man, called us into his office and explained as gently as possible that Matthew had a rare form of cancer in his central nervous system. The words seemed to echo in my head as if spoken in a foreign language. "Cancer. My son, 6 years old. What are the chances of a cure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The doctor hesitated for a moment before answering, "It's an aggressive disease, and the location makes treatment particularly challenging. We will do everything in our power, but I need to be honest with you. We're talking about a survival rate of around 15 to 20%. Lucy collapsed and cried right there in the doctor's office. I hugged her, trying to be strong for her, but inside I felt as if my whole world was crumbling. How was this possible? How could a loving God allow an innocent child, raised in the ways of faith, to face something so terrible? The weeks that followed were the most difficult of my life. Matthew began aggressive treatment that included chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Watching my little son, always so full of life, wither day by day, was a torture I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. He lost his hair, lost weight, lost that infectious energy that had always characterized him. But he never lost his faith. "Daddy," he said one night, as I sat beside his hospital bed, "do you think Jesus knows I'm sick?" The question broke my heart. "Of course he does, son," I replied, swallowing back tears. "He knows everything. Then why doesn't he heal me?" Came the next question, posed with the devastating innocence of a child who doesn't yet understand the complexities of life and faith. I didn't know what to answer. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes God allows suffering for reasons we can't comprehend? How do you maintain your faith when you're watching your most precious child battle a disease that doctors say is incurable? I started questioning everything I believed in. During the long nights of vigil in the hospital, while Matthew slept under the influence of medication, I would stare out the window of the room, asking God why he was silent. I fasted for days. I organized prayer campaigns at church. I asked that all the churches in the town include Matthew in their prayers. But he kept getting worse. It was on one of those lonely nights in the hospital that I had a dream unlike any other. I was in a landscape I couldn't identify, perhaps a field, perhaps a garden, and the same woman from previous dreams was there, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her was Matthew, but not the sick and frail Matthew I knew at that moment. It was my son as he had been before the illness, full of life, smiling, playing. In the dream, she placed her hand on Matthew's head, and I could see a soft light emanating from that touch. Then she looked directly at me, and for the first time in all those dreams, she spoke, "Trust, I'm not far away." Her voice was exactly as I imagined it would be, gentle, maternal, carrying a kind authority that admitted no doubt. I woke up with a start in the uncomfortable chair beside the hospital bed, my heart pounding. I looked at Matthew, who was sleeping soundly, and for a moment I had the impression of seeing a subtle light around his small figure. But when I blinked, the impression disappeared. That same morning, against all medical expectations, Matthew's clinical picture began to show signs of improvement. Small signs, almost imperceptible, but which were picked up by the monitors and confirmed by the tests. His energy level increased slightly, the fever subsided, and for the first time in weeks he asked for something specific to eat, a cheese sandwich, which had always been his favorite snack. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but made it clear that it was still too early to celebrate. "These cases can have fluctuations," the oncologist explained. "We'll continue to monitor closely," but I felt that something had changed. I couldn't explain what, but there was a difference in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, we were turning a corner. That's when we decided that I would return home a few nights a week to take care of little Lily and try to maintain some normalcy in our lives. Lucy would stay at the hospital with Matthew, and we would take turns as needed. That first night at home, after weeks of practically living in the hospital, the house seemed strangely silent. Lily was already asleep, cared for by my mother-in-law, and I found myself alone in the living room, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few weeks. That's when I saw the image again. The small statue of the Virgin Mary was on the living room shelf, exactly where I had left it weeks before, but now there was something different about it. Or maybe the difference was in me. Instead of the anger and contempt I had always felt when I saw her, I experienced something completely new, a feeling of recognition, of deep familiarity. I approached the shelf and picked up the image in my hands. It was the first time I had touched it without feeling repulsed. Her features were delicate, sculpted with a care I had never noticed before. The eyes in particular seemed to convey the same expression of unconditional love that I had seen so many times in my dreams. "You're her, aren't you?" I murmured to the small figure. "You're the woman from my dreams." It may seem crazy to talk to a plaster image, but at that moment, I felt like I was talking to a real person, someone who had been with me throughout that difficult journey, even when I didn't realize it. And it was at that moment that everything connected. The strange visions I had had since I moved to Grandma's house, the dreams with the mysterious woman, the constant feeling of being watched, protected, Matthew's inexplicable improvement, everything was part of something bigger, something that my rational mind had always refused to accept, but that my heart, deep down, always knew to be true. I knelt right there in the living room, holding the small image against my chest, and for the first time in my adult life, I prayed not only to Jesus, but also to the one I had always rejected as idolatry. "If you really exist," I whispered, "if you really can intercede for us, please save my son. I promise I'll never despise your presence again. I promise I'll understand." I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. I cried all the anger, all the fear, all the arrogance I had carried for so many years. I cried for my ignorance, for my refusal to accept that God could work through paths I didn't understand. And as I cried, I felt a peace descending upon me, the same peace I had experienced in the dreams, the same feeling of being held by maternal arms that never abandoned me. When I finally calmed down, I put the image back on the shelf, but this time with reverence, with gratitude, and that night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The following day,
When I returned to the hospital, I found a completely perplexed medical team. Matthew's tests showed a dramatic and inexplicable improvement. The tumor had significantly shrunk, his blood markers were normalizing, and my son was sitting up in bed, playing with his toy cars as if nothing had happened. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted the oncologist, flipping through the test results with an expression of complete disbelief. "I have no medical explanation for this recovery. It's what we call spontaneous remission, but in cases like Matthew's, it's statistically almost impossible." Lucy looked at me with tears in her eyes. "It's a miracle," she whispered. "God answered our prayers." I agreed, but in my heart I knew there was more to the story. I knew our prayer had been answered through an intercession I had always refused to acknowledge, but which had been present in our lives all along. In the weeks that followed, Matthew continued to improve steadily and surprisingly. The tumor practically disappeared, the side effects of the treatment were minimized, and soon he was back at school, running, playing, once again the cheerful child he always was. Doctors have been monitoring him to this day, 5 years later, and he remains completely free of the disease. But the real transformation happened in me. I didn't abandon my faith in Jesus. On the contrary, it grew immensely stronger. But I learned that God works in mysterious ways, through paths that our limited minds cannot always comprehend or accept. I learned that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is not an obstacle to the Christian faith, but a bridge, a gentle intercessor, who leads us directly to the heart of the Son. Today, that small image I once threw in the trash with anger and contempt occupies a place of honor in my home, not as an idol to be worshipped, but as a constant reminder that God's love is greater than our prejudices, our limitations, our religious arrogance. It's a reminder that sometimes we need to become like children, to understand truths that our adult wisdom insists on rejecting. I still attend an evangelical church, but with a completely transformed perspective. I no longer preach against Catholicism with the same vehemence as before. I've learned to respect different ways of expressing faith, as long as they are based on genuine love for God. And when I meet other evangelicals who manifest the same prejudice I had against images and the intercession of saints, I try to share my story, hoping that perhaps it can open their hearts as mine was opened. Matthew, now 11 years old, doesn't remember many details about his illness, which is perhaps a blessing, but he knows he went through something difficult, and that God healed him through a miracle. Sometimes, I find him looking at the image in the living room with curiosity, and when he asks about it, I explain that she is someone very special, who took care of our family when we needed it most. "She's pretty," he said one day. "She looks like a mother." And he was right. She is a mother, the mother of Jesus, but also, in a way, our mother. The mother of all those who, like me, sometimes need to be rescued from their own arrogance, their own spiritual blindness. If you've come this far in this story, it's perhaps because you also need to hear that there is not just one way God works in our lives. Perhaps you, like me, have built theological walls so high that they prevent you from seeing the beauty of diversity in the Christian faith. Perhaps you have rejected people, traditions, or forms of worship that could have enriched your spiritual journey. I learned that God is much bigger than our denominations, much wiser than our doctrinal systems, much more loving than our religious prejudices. I learned that He can use a rejected image to teach humility, can use dreams to open hardened hearts, can use a tradition we despise to show us aspects of His love that we had never considered. The small image of the Virgin Mary remains in my living room, but now it represents much more than a simple decoration or family memento. It represents my journey back to humility, my reconciliation with aspects of the faith that I had rejected out of ignorance. It represents the moment I stopped being a Christian who knew all the answers and became a disciple willing to learn. Sometimes, When I'm going through difficult times, I pick up the small statue and remember everything that happened in those transformative months. I remember the dreams, Matthew's inexplicable healing, the feeling of peace I experienced when I finally opened my heart to a truth that was right in front of me, but that I refused to see. Lucy also changed during this journey. Initially, she was confused by my new perspective, worried that I was straying from the evangelical faith. But when she saw the fruits of this transformation, how I became more tolerant, more compassionate, more open to interfaith dialogue, she also began to question some of the prejudices we carried. Today we are a different family. We continue to love Jesus with all our hearts. We continue to believe in salvation by grace. We continue to value the study of Scripture. But we do all this with a more open, more humble heart, more willing to acknowledge that God can surprise our theological expectations. Matthew has grown into a sensitive and spiritually mature boy. Sometimes, I hear him praying alone in his room, and his prayers include thanks to that lady who took care of me when I was sick. He doesn't fully understand the theology behind it all, but his childlike heart grasps truths that we adults unnecessarily complicate. Lily, now 7, has an even more natural relationship with spirituality. For her, there's no conflict between loving Jesus and respecting Mary. She sometimes talks to the statue as if it were a friend, telling her about her day, asking for protection for the family, and I let her, because I've learned that God can speak to us through the innocence of children, in ways our adult rationality could never comprehend. My mother-in-law, who has always been a devout Catholic, was thrilled when she heard about our experience. I always prayed that you would one day understand, she confessed to me, tears in her eyes. I never tried to impose my faith on you, but I always asked the Virgin Mary to open your hearts. Today we have a much closer relationship, united not only by family ties, but also by a mutual understanding of the different paths that lead to the same God. In the church we attend, my change of perspective initially caused some controversy. Some brothers and sisters were worried, thinking I was drifting towards Catholicism. I had long conversations with the pastor, explaining that I hadn't abandoned any fundamental truth of the evangelical faith, but had simply expanded my understanding of how God works in the world. Gradually, many in the congregation began to understand that it's possible to maintain our evangelical identity while respecting and even learning from other Christian traditions. Today, our church has a much more open dialogue with the local Catholic community. We participate in some joint social actions, and we've discovered that we have much more in common than we imagined. This doesn't mean ignoring the real doctrinal differences that exist between denominations, but it means I've learned to focus on what unites us: the love of Christ, the desire to serve those in need, the pursuit of a holy life, instead of obsessing over the differences that separate us. The experience also made me more sensitive to the stories of other people who have gone through similar spiritual transformations. I've met Catholics who developed a more personal relationship with Jesus after visiting evangelical churches. I've met Orthodox Christians who rediscovered the importance of grace after studying Reformed theology. I've met Pentecostals who deepened their contemplative life after encountering monastic spirituality. All these stories confirm to me that God is always working to lead us to a fuller understanding of His truth, and He uses the most diverse means to do so, even small plaster statues we throw in the trash out of prejudice. Today, when I look back, I see how my spiritual journey has been marked by different seasons. There was the season of arrogant certainty, when I thought I had all the answers. There was the season of crisis, when everything I believed was tested by my son's suffering. There was the season of discovery, when my heart opened to truths my mind had rejected. And now I live in the season of integration, trying to harmonize everything I've learned into a more mature and comprehensive faith. I know I still have much to learn. I know I'll probably go through other crises, other discoveries, other transformations, but now I face this with expectation instead of fear, because I've learned that God is always leading us to a better place, even when the path seems confusing or painful. The small statue of the Virgin Mary continues to remind me daily that God's love is vaster than our limited understandings, deeper than our theological systems, more inclusive than our denominational prejudices. It reminds me that sometimes we need to be broken to be rebuilt. We need to lose our certainties to find true faith. We need to empty ourselves to be filled. And if you're going through a faith crisis, if you're questioning truths you've always considered absolute, if you're being challenged to expand your spiritual understanding, I want you to know that this may be exactly what God is using to lead you to a place of greater maturity and fullness. Don't be afraid to question. Don't be afraid to admit that maybe you don't have all the answers. Don't be afraid to open your heart to truths your mind initially rejects, because that's exactly what led me to the most beautiful miracle of my life. Not only the physical healing of my son, but the spiritual healing of my own heart, hardened by religious pride. Today, I am a different man, more humble, more tolerant, more open to mystery, and I can say with all sincerity that I have never been as happy in my faith as I am now, when I finally understood that following Jesus doesn't mean building walls, but breaking down the barriers that prevent us from loving as He loved. The statue remains there, on the living room shelf, as a silent bridge between the man I was and the man I have become. And every time I look at it, I whisper a small prayer of gratitude. Thank you for never leaving me, even when I couldn't see. Thank you for using even my rejection to teach me about unconditional love. Thank you for saving my son, and in the process, saving me too. This is my story, a story of transformation, of humility learned through suffering, of faith expanded through crisis. And if it touched your heart in some way, if it made you rethink some of your own certainties or prejudices, then it has fulfilled its purpose. Because in the end, we are all pilgrims on this journey of faith. We are all learning. We are all being shaped by the experiences God allows in our lives. And sometimes, the most important lessons come through the most unexpected paths, through the people we despise, through the traditions we reject, through the small statues we throw in the trash out of pride, but which God uses to show us that His love is far greater than our ability to comprehend it.